My name is Shara Babcock. I serve Chautauqua as Vice President and Emily and Richard Smucker Chair for Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Hall of Philosophy for the second of three parts of the 2017 Middle East Update. After you turn off your electronic equipment, this concludes the afternoon announcements. Chautauqua Institution is deeply committed to dialogue and understanding of the conflicts in the Middle East. Each summer, we invite experts to come to Chautauqua to provide us with a Middle East update in recognition of the importance Chautauquans place in achieving a meaningful and lasting peace in this essential region. Our partner in this effort is Dr. Geoffrey Kemp, Director of Regional Security Programs at the Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kemp served in the first Reagan White House as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Prior to his current position, he was a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he was Director of the Middle East Arms Control Project. Well known to our audience, Dr. Kemp has been updating us on foreign affairs for the past 23 years. You deserve that. Joining Jeff today is Geoffrey al-Omari, Senior Fellow in the Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship at the Washington Institute. Former Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, he previously served in various capacities within the Palestinian Authority, including Director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President and advisor to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. His extensive experience with the Palestinian-Israeli peace process includes participation in the 2000 Camp David Summit. After the breakdown of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, an unofficial model peace agreement. A lawyer by training, Mr. al-Omari has also taught international law and has been involved in human rights advocacy. So, ladies and gentlemen, experts and concerned citizens, please join me in welcoming both Geoffrey Kemp and Geoffrey al-Omari back to Chautauqua.
Thank you very much, Shara, and delighted to see a good audience again. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you were here yesterday? Oh, good. So I do not have to repeat everything I said yesterday, but in case one or two newcomers have drifted in, we had a presentation yesterday by Shai Feldman based on the idea that this week is the theme at Chautauqua is the nature of fear. And what I asked Shai to do, and what Ghaith is going to do, hopefully this afternoon, is talk about the fear from the perspective of, yesterday we heard from an Israeli, both historical and contemporary fears, and today we're going to hear from a Palestinian about, again, historic and contemporary fears. We will try not to get into too much dialogue today about the ongoing non-negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians and what the Trump administration's up to and what the mess in the region means for the peace process. That's what we're going to do tomorrow. Today we want to focus on this issue of threat and fear, and in particular some of the existential historic issues that have plagued the Palestinians in their search for peace. So how it's going to work is how I did yesterday. Ghaith will talk for about 15 minutes, and I will then sort of interrupt him, and he and I will have a little dialogue. We will then break, and people will line up for questions, as they usually do, and you are more than welcome to ask questions. No speeches, since we always have a good list of speakers to ask questions, and we want to get through that list as quickly as we can. So, Ghaith, without any further ado, tell us about the fundamental fears of the Palestinian nation and peoples, And bearing in mind that you've got an audience here that stretches to the Hall of Missions over there, please articulate carefully into the mic because we've been having some acoustic problems this year.
All right. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Thank you, Shara. Thank you for inviting me and for whoever arranged the weather like this. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I mean, we're going to be talking about fear, and I will get into that in a minute. But it's worth noting before I start that only talking about fear does not do justice to the Palestinian experience. It's an important component. It's an important issue. It's an issue that definitely has to be dealt with. But there is more to Palestinians than that. There is creativity. There is a sense of agency. So these are all aspects. But since our topic today is fear, we're going to be talking about fear, and I will try to address it from 3 different angles. Fear as a lived reality for many Palestinians. Fear as a component of the creation and development of national identity and national narrative. And fear as a component in looking at the future. And how did that affect it? And I might conclude with a few words about how do you address issues of fear in a national level. So let me start maybe with what fear means for day-to-day lives for many Palestinians. Palestinians who are living under the occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and in a more complicated way, maybe Gaza Strip. I mean, at the very foundation of the experience of fear is the experience of occupation, which is about a sense of disempowerment and a sense of lack of control over your fate. In its most extreme cases, it's fear when things are hot, when things are active, when there is active conflict. Fear that your kid, you yourself, your loved one will leave and never come back. Fear of the violence that is part of episodes that dot the experience of occupation. But even in normal circumstances, normal between quotations, living under the occupation is an experience where you simply have no control over your fate. You go to visit a family, a relative, a friend in a different village, you stop at a checkpoint, you don't know. Will you wait for half an hour? Will you wait for 3 hours? Will you be allowed to pass? Not allowed to pass? Will it be a humiliating experience? The sense of lack of control. Your home, your family grows. You want to build additional units to your home. What do? You apply to the Israelis, knowing that you're not going to get a permit. Do you build without a permit, living under the fear that your home is going to be demolished? At the fundamental center of it is a sense that there is no control and there is no recourse. In a normal polity, ultimately, those who govern you are accountable to you, politically, legally, etc. Under occupation, that is not the case. I can go on and on and on about this, but I will not. It's a life experience for many, but this is, to me, what sums up fear as a daily experience for a good chunk of Palestinians who are living in occupied territories. Fear has also been quite an important component in creating and defining Palestinian narrative and therefore identity. And that is on 2 levels. One level is if you look at Palestinian history itself, at least how it is taught, both in the formal education systems, but also in informal processes, culture, art, poetry, etc. Palestinian history is often recognized by Palestinians and studied as a series of traumas. Beginning in 1948, with the mass displacement that was a result of the creation of Israel, moved to 1967, the loss of land that happened there, moved to 1971, the expulsion of Palestinians from Jordan, moved to 1982, the massacres in Beirut, and then the expulsion of Palestinians from Beirut. And even today, if you look at the tragedy of Syria, Palestinian refugees who are living in Syria right now are one of the most vulnerable groups in that extremely bloody scenario. This series of traumas, this series of painful experiences has come to define how Palestinians look at their history. And often you talk to Palestinians, you look at Palestinian cultural products, and it's almost waiting for the next disaster to hit. There is almost a recognition that history, or a resignation, that history is a series of traumas that will occur. This is partly true based on historic record, but it's also, unfortunately, I would say here, something that many Palestinian leaders have peddled in, sought to amplify, and sought to govern by building an identity that is centered around fear and around victimhood. That's one aspect of the identity and of the narrative. Another aspect relates to the question of denial. What do I mean by that? Throughout at least modern Palestinian history, modern Palestinian nationalism, there was always a concern that the existence of Palestinian identity and nationhood is always being threatened or denied. And this comes from two levels, from two sources. Every Palestinian very early on gets introduced to that infamous statement by Golda Meir, an Israeli prime minister of the 70s, who said that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. The idea that Palestinians are just other Arabs, other Muslims. A denial of Palestinian identity, which unfortunately is something that is always recurring in cyclical ways, and we're seeing it emerging again. But another source of this denial comes from actually Arab countries. It's not a denial of identity, it's a denial of agency. And very much a part of defining Palestinian national movement in modern history is a Palestinian struggle against Arab countries that want to own the Palestinian issue and to speak for the Palestinians and have the Palestinians objectified, not as the ones who speak for themselves. This was at its height in the midst of what we call the Arab Cold War. That's the period of the 50s and the 60s, where was a major struggle between the Arab revolutionary governments under the leadership of Nasser and the conservative monarchies, pro-Western monarchies, Saudi Arabia, etc. Jordan was the key actor. And in the middle of the fight between those, the issue of Palestine was one of the proxy issues that was tried to be owned by all of these, and the Palestinians were the ones who were actually did not have a voice in this. And this really led, in many ways, to the emergence of the current Palestinian political leadership. The fear of denial, be it denial from the Israelis, be it denial of identity, be it denial of agency, has also made the Palestinians extremely, how shall I say it, paranoid. But, you know, you can be paranoid and they can still be after you. There is a great sense of sensitivity and concern for this kind of issue. So there's experience, there is fear as a lived experience, there's fear as a construct in terms of building identity, and part of the tragedies, I believe, in this whole conflict, and this is, I think, true for the Israelis, but I will only talk about the Palestinians in this case, is how when you live under fear for so long, when you have actually generations now who have known nothing but fear, fear as a part of who they are and fear as a part of their experience, fear becomes the normal. And in many Palestinians, and I've seen this in many interaction, be it in the negotiation setting, when I was a negotiator, or even in almost private settings as I talk to Palestinians, when fear has become, and conflict has become, such a part of your identity and of who you are, this is the reality as you understand it. It has become something that reminds me, and I apologize for this analogy, it reminds me of an abusive relationship, where the parties, the Palestinians and the Israelis, in their head, they know that peace is good for them. Yet, they have learned to live with conflict. They have learned to live with fear. They have developed coping mechanisms. It becomes predictable. And often, when you're at the cusp or at the edge of reaching peace or at the edge of taking an important transformative decision, there is an irrational fear here. And this is something that, again, I've seen in negotiations, and I believe this is something that, as we look at the future, this is an aspect of fear that is not only one that relates to the Palestinians themselves, but relates to the ability to make decisions in the long term to reach peace. Fear is there. Fear is a reality. The question is, how do we deal with fear? We don't deal with fear through rational argument. That is for sure. Fear is an irrational aspect of who we are, and simply lecturing someone about how wrong they are to fear gets you nowhere. Fear is often dealt with by leaders who have the legitimacy, the courage, and the standing to go to their public and to give them assurance. And this actually is often a product of two interlinked characteristics of leaders. Some are personal characteristics, some relate to the actual legitimacy. And in history, in Middle Eastern history, if we look at actually how peace was made, it was made by these kinds of strong, larger-than-life leaders who have legitimacy and who had courage. And many of them actually paid the ultimate price with their lives for it. Sadat, going to the Knesset in Israel in the late 70s and explicitly saying, let's break the barrier of fear. Rabin, Arafat, King Hussein of Jordan. These are the kind of leaders who had both legitimacy and had the courage to do what needed to be done. Unfortunately, tragically, as I look at the map today, at the map of the Palestinian politics, of Israeli politics, of regional politics, sadly, I don't see these kinds of leaders. In the Palestinian case, I look at Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president. His history actually contains episodes where he was courageous. At the beginning of the Second Intifada, when violence was the flavor of the day, he was one of the few to stand up and say, I am against violence. Yet, since he became president, he has shown himself to be a very risk-averse leader who first takes the temperature of the street and acts accordingly rather than lead the street. And more importantly, he is a leader that lacks legitimacy, partly because of his failure to achieve peace via negotiations, but also partly because of the way that he has ruled the Palestinian Authority, corruption, mismanagement, closing the political space, etc. And he has not allowed others to emerge. I look at Israel, it's not much more hopeful than it is. I look around the region, I certainly see no Sadat, and I see no Hussein, and I see none of these. It puts us in a situation where we have to live with fear, and this fear will become, and continues to be, one of the most potent elements in this conflict. I don't want to end, though, on this super pessimistic note. Let me maybe throw two possible notes of optimism. One relates to actually the nature of leadership. And if you look at great leaders, often the history is not a good guide to the future. What do I mean by that? I mentioned Sadat, who in my view probably is one of the most significant figures in modern Middle Eastern history. Sadat was appointed as deputy to Nasser specifically because he was seen as the weakest, least intelligent, least ambitious person of that generation. Itzhak Rabin, looked at as a leader of, as almost the paragon and epitome of peacemaking. For Palestinians, until he made peace, he was known as the Minister of Defense who instructed his soldiers to break the bones of peaceful demonstrators. As Ariel Sharon used to say, where you stand is where you sit. When you sit in that chair, you change. So much as I don't see right now these leaders, I don't think this is a reason for a lack of hope. Often leadership is not a function of a rational analysis and expectation. It's a function of circumstances that produce leaders. And the other, and I will conclude on this point, interesting, maybe not hopeful, but interesting point is, in the midst of this grim situation, in the midst of what I see as erosion, stagnation, almost collapse of the Palestinian national movement, you're starting to hear new Palestinian voices. Ones that emphasize not fear, but agency. Who emphasize not victimhood, but taking charge of one's own destiny. Some of these voices are very troubling. They look at agency through violence. Others are less troubling. Where these will come, I don't know. But there is definitely, as I speak, now we are at a time of transition, of change, and the boat seems to be agreeing with me. And in these kinds of change, this is actually where leaderships emerge. This is where what people like myself, analysts, do becomes maybe less important, and what people on the ground do becomes the defining things. And therefore, don't let people like myself depress you too much, because things are happening and things might actually overtake us. With this, I think I will conclude, and thank you very much.
You've certainly begun your oration. You've begun your thesis. You haven't finished it, because I'm going to push you a little further on some of these questions. Now, could you say a little bit as to whether or not the same perceptions of fear and hope for the future apply to the diaspora? And the Palestinian diaspora, as we all know, is spread all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East, in countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And one gets the sense that there is a sort of different cultural attitude towards their future and their past. Could you say a little bit about how the Palestinian Authority and the people you worked with consider the fate of the diaspora in thinking about the future?
It's a very difficult question simply because there is no one diaspora. Right. If you talk about the diaspora, actually you're talking about very different experiences shaped of where the diaspora is. As you rightly mentioned, the Palestinian diaspora is all over the place. In some areas, their connection to the Palestinian issue is purely symbolic. You know, Latin America, you go to Chile, you go to Argentina. Many Palestinians, frankly, whose link is very much really at the level of they eat Palestinian food 3 times a year as a way of kind of having the linkage. That's the extent of it. You look at Jordan, for example, where Palestinian diaspora has been given citizenship.
Jordan, you said.
In Jordan,
yes.
Jordan, in that case, the Palestinian diaspora is important but not seen as a politically active diaspora. It's been more or less co-opted by the Jordanian regime and is willing to follow whatever the Jordanian regime and the Palestinian official leadership might produce. The two interesting and active aspects of the diaspora that, frankly, the Palestinian official leadership has failed to address are the ones who are vulnerable in some Arab countries. I mentioned Syria, and the other vulnerable community is in Lebanon. These are Palestinian diasporas that have been given no political rights and no political representation, and therefore are restive, and therefore become often prey to many of the more, how shall I say it, extreme or hardline voices. In Lebanon, we have a major problem of radicalization in the refugee camps. In Syria, we saw many Palestinian refugees finding themselves stuck between ISIS and the regime, end up defecting to ISIS because they saw it as the lesser of two evils. So that is a diaspora that I think the failure of the Palestinian leadership to address their grievances and to protect them has ultimately brought into question the representational nature of the Palestinian leadership, and brings up a question for the future. If the Palestinian leadership reaches a peace deal, would these people feel bound by it? The other component, and if I may, this one, because it affects many of us here, is the diaspora in the West, in this country, in Europe, and elsewhere. And this is the diaspora, and if you have to look at the Palestinian history, until the creation of the Palestinian Authority, Arafat and his cohort saw this diaspora as an integral part of their power base, courted them, included them in the decision-making process, etc. When the Palestinian Authority was created, all of the resources, all of the thinking, all of the energy went into building this leadership, and the diaspora was ignored. We're talking about fear. The major fear of the current Palestinian diaspora here is a fear of marginalization. You see these people, marginalization. Palestinians who feel as connected to the land as anyone else, they feel marginalized. On the one hand, because they're not part of the Palestinian decision-making process, and they feel marginalized because they feel their issue in their countries of nationality, the US and Europe, their voices are not heard. They're stuck somewhere in between. And these are becoming very active in many of the, if you wish, minority politics, and becoming a voice that one needs to be heard, and as of yet, no one is hearing that voice.
Well, thank you. That's extremely interesting. Now, one thing you mentioned I thought was interesting was that the bad luck that many Palestinians have faced in the Middle East at the hands of various Arab governments. And I'm just particularly interested in what happened to all the Palestinians who supported Saddam Hussein during his invasion of Kuwait, because that got a lot of publicity at the time, and many of them had very, very prestigious, good jobs in Kuwait, and were all expelled. What happened to them? Did they go to any one place, or are they diffused all over the world?
I mean, first of all, just for the sake of maybe reframing the question a little bit, I think what we had during the invasion is the Palestinian leadership, Arafat and the PLO leadership, clearly sided with Saddam. Many of the Palestinians who were actually living in Kuwait did not side with Saddam. Many felt, some did, but many felt that Kuwait was their home. And as you said, many of them had prestigious jobs, etc., etc. Many felt culturally, economically integrated. Most of them were, as you said, expelled. Most were Palestinians with Jordanian citizenship. Many of them moved to Jordan. Most of them moved to Jordan. Many of them managed to move with enough economic means to settle. What we saw there was very interesting. We had a new generation of Palestinians who really did not have much of a connection with Palestine, having to rediscover their Palestinianness. In Kuwait, Palestinians in Kuwait were often integrated. In Jordan, there is a degree, while there is citizenship, there is a degree of social separation. They had to discover their citizenship. Yet I would say, on the positive side here, that one of the best things that happened to Jordan was this influx of these returnees. Sad and tragic as it is for these people to be made refugees again from homes that they brought Jordan, which was Amman, which was a very provincial city. They brought money, so economic resources, but they also brought culture, art, and things of this sort. Today, most of them, I would say, have forgotten the Kuwait experience, are beyond it. Some of them might think of it, in a kind of nostalgic way, but most of them are actually well settled in Jordan right now. Sadly, however, right now there is a very, very low presence of Palestinians in the Gulf region.
So, last question from me before we turn to you. You mentioned towards the end some of your more hopeful thoughts about the future, in particular, future leadership. Could you say a little bit about the younger generation of educated Palestinians who will, if they are given the opportunity, clearly have a major role to play in any negotiations with Israel and ultimately building a Palestinian state? But to what extent is there a sort of countervailing ideology that to some extent is in favor of the type of violence that you see particularly in al-Qaeda and ISIS and throughout the region?
Let me start with the latter, maybe. Within Palestinian perception, and this is not something that I personally condone, it's something that I disagree with, but within general Palestinian perception, there is a difference between the kind of terrorism that is conducted by al-Qaeda or ISIS, some of these global jihadi groups, but what they perceive as, what many Palestinians perceive as legitimate resistance. Right. One that I and many would call as terrorism, yet within the Palestinian national narrative, the issue of the right to resist is one that still finds a lot of support. What we saw recently, for example, the last couple of years, there have been a wave of terror attacks against Israelis, stabbings, car rammings, things of this sort. Even those Palestinians who thought that they will never do something like this, who thought that they disagree with it, still felt that it was a legitimate response to occupation. So there is, even those who think that violence is not the right way to go, still recognize and give legitimacy to those who give violence. This is a very complicated, very damaging, but very real phenomenon that we have among the Palestinians. And many of those who support are of the category that you mentioned in the first part of your question. The support for this violence is similar and equal within, I would say, the various strata of Palestinians. The one variable that actually affects whether or not you support violence is the extent to which a Palestinian knows Israelis. Now, this is an interesting, we're talking about fear, and there's a big fear of the unknown. And maybe let me go on a personal anecdote for a bit. I grew up in Jordan. The first Israeli I met was when I was in Washington, D.C. in my early 20s. She was a professor where I went to law school. And I decided to walk into her class to kind of listen to what an Israeli has to say. When I walked in, I was literally shaking and sweating. I was scared in a real palpable way. I got to know her. I got to know other Israelis. And a lot of these fears disappeared. And I got to understand a bit of the complexity of what Israel is. When I moved to Ramallah in 1997, this journey that I went through personally, most Palestinians went through themselves because Palestinians at that period dealt with Israelis on a daily basis. Not only Israelis as soldiers manning checkpoints, but Israelis as business partners, as job providers, as social contacts. Over the years, over the last 15, 20 years, a lot of this interaction has disappeared. Partly because of the obstacles to movement, checkpoints, things of this sort that do not allow them to meet, and partly because of some voices among Palestinians who socially ostracize and penalize those Palestinians who want to engage with Israelis, what they call the anti-normalization. Today, Palestinians don't know Israelis, and Israelis don't know Palestinians. And what research has shown, Palestinians who know Israelis tend to be less supportive of violence, because they know that the victim of this violence and terrorism might be one of the good many Israelis that they gotten to know. Those who don't know Israelis tend to be more supportive of that. So if I look at one thing to look in the future, how can we reignite and recreate a situation where Palestinians and Israelis interact, where they know one another as complex, multifaceted societies? We don't see that, unfortunately. We see the worst stereotypes of the other being propagated, and with that, with the dehumanization of the other, violence against the other becomes problematic. One last point about economically developed and economically ambitious, if you wish, Palestinians. I think there is a misperception, certainly among some Israeli decision makers, that give people an economic standard of life and they will forget about national aspirations. I think everyone deserves a good standard of living, and I think this is something that we should advocate for its own right. Yet it's worth noting that actually the two major episodes of confrontation between Palestinians and Israelis, the first and second intifadas, happened at times where the economy was not doing that bad. Ultimately, the issue and the conflict is political and has to be resolved politically. Economy, religion, interaction, all of these things are supportive elements, and we need to cultivate them. But ultimately, if we don't address the political underpinnings, I think all of the other issues will become secondary.
Well, that's a very good place to sort of end right now, and it's something that I'm certain we'll take up tomorrow when we talk more about leadership and practical issues. Now we've come to question time, so will you please line up? And of course, thank you. Thank you for an excellent sort of introduction to this highly complicated subject. And we'll start with here on the right, my friend Edith Everett.
Thank you very much. That was a very lucid, wonderful presentation. As we know, hundreds of thousands of Jews fled from Arab countries to Israel, some to other places, but mostly to Israel, and Israel absorbed them as citizens. That was not true of those who fled, the Palestinians. Now, during what was it called? Desert Storm, you mentioned. 200,000, it's estimated there were 200,000 Palestinians who were absolutely thrown out of the country, stateless, no papers, no place to go. That's only one part. Others came to Lebanon, okay? Hundreds of thousands for 3 generations or more are sitting in camps, supported by the international community to the tune of billions of dollars all these years. What is wrong with these people that can't absorb their own? I don't get it. Do you?
Put it that way, it's difficult to respond to, but let me look at it actually. Let me frame it the way that many Palestinians frame it and look at it. First of all, for the Lebanese, and for that matter for the Jordanians and for the Syrians, the Palestinians are not their own. They are brethren. They are, of the same ethnic maybe group. They speak the same language, etc. But they are not their own. Palestinian nationalism is one of nationalisms that developed in that region. A Lebanese feels a Lebanese and feels no direct obligation to a Palestinian. A Jordanian feels a Jordanian and feels no particular national obligation to the Palestinians. And I think in many ways, and here I don't want to go there, but because I think the Jewish experience is very, very different from the Palestinian one, and the Jewish experience in terms of how profound the suffering is, it cannot be matched. Yet, there is an analogy to be drawn here. In the same way that the Zionist movement, ultimately, a big part of the Zionist movement is a realization that until the Jews have a home of their own, a country of their own, when they're not in someone else's country, they will always be vulnerable. Until the Jews understood that there has to be a country of last resort. When everything else fails, you can go back to your homeland. That's the very essence, in my view, of Zionism. And for the Palestinians, what their experience has taught them is when they are guests in someone else's home, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, elsewhere, you will always be vulnerable. Again, I look at the current tragedy in Syria. There were many, many nationalities living in Syria, many communities. You know, Jordanians who were living in Syria came back to Jordan. Lebanese who were living in Syria went back to Lebanon. The Palestinians who were expelled from the refugee camps came to Jordan, and the Jordanians said, "You're not our citizens, not our problem." Went to Lebanon, the same. Went to Turkey, the same. The whole yearning for a state of the Palestinians' own is part of the understanding that if you don't have a homeland that only you control, not someone else, not your brother, not your cousin, not your uncle, but you control, you will never be safe. I think this is the bottom line. One last footnote here. While I stand by what I said, I do believe that the way that the Palestinians have been treated in Lebanon and Syria is unconscionable. It's one thing to say that I don't want to absorb you for political reasons, but to keep them in the poverty, in the almost subhuman conditions, mainly in Lebanon, is simply unconscionable, irrespective of what one can separate between political aspirations and doing the right thing towards a vulnerable population.
Thank you. That was as coherent an explanation I've ever heard of that distinction, and thank you very much for it. Now, next question here.
Yeah, speaking of fear versus hope, what is the status of the BDS movement? Because it is certainly feared and hated in Israel and the US, where many states have legislated against it. But are Palestinians still pursuing that particular path, or have they given up on that?
You know, the BDS movement.
Could you explain what the question was? Because I didn't quite understand it here.
I understand it. I mean, there's a movement called the BDS movement that stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the idea is, in the same way that South Africa could be pressured into abandoning apartheid through boycotts, Israel can be pressured to abandoning some of its policies via boycotts. Let me give you maybe the official answer, you know, what a Palestinian official would give you, and let me give you my own personal view. The Palestinian official view is the following. They support BDS only as it relates to boycotting settlements and clear manifestations of the occupation. Right. The logic being, if you call for a two-state solution, one of the states is Israel, and if you try to delegitimize it, then you're abandoning the whole premise of a two-state solution. Right. On the other hand, occupation is illegitimate, and anything to delegitimize it is seen as acceptable and legit. The problem with the BDS movement, though, it is not the problem, but the nature of the BDS movement, it is that it is not actually an official movement. It's a movement created by the diaspora, primarily the diaspora that is in the West, the United States and Europe. I have two problems with the BDS movement. One, that relates to the composition of the movement and to the messaging from the movement. Right. I am of the official view, I share the official view, that you cannot delegitimize Israel. There are many things Israel does that is wrong. There is no country that I know that does good all the time. You can criticize Israeli policies, I think that's legitimate, but to delegitimize the very essence of Israel is simply wrong, morally and politically wrong. The BDS movement does not take a position on this, and BDS movement often boycotts Israel. I see that as a threat to the two-state solution, which is the only way, in my view, to move forward. The composition of the BDS movement also is very loose, which means that it has many within its cadres who are, you know, there are some people who are in it because they feel that this is the way to pressure Israel. It allows some people with less acceptable views, namely some anti-Semites, to be part of that movement. And until a movement clearly disavows that component of it, the whole movement, in my mind, remains suspect. Then there is another, this is in terms of the composition and the message. But at a more fundamental level, there is a question of tactics. And this is very subjective. My own belief is the way to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you end it via dialogue, via addressing each side's deep concerns and deep fears. At the end of the day, I mean, this is maybe for tomorrow, but if you don't convince the Israelis that their core fears, acceptance and security, are going to be met, and if you don't convince the Palestinians that their core fears, also acceptance and dignity and independence will be respected, there will be no peace. We can pressure, we can intimidate, we can do all of that. Ultimately, the sides will not move. And I believe BDS thrives and peddles in fear. It is about pressure, it's about scaring, it's about cornering, and it produces the exact opposite effect of what it should produce. Many Israelis and many American Jews and others who are sympathetic to Israel, who are also sympathetic to Palestine, find themselves cornered, lumped in with the most extreme elements within Israeli society, and therefore they become defensive. You lose potential partners when you only apply pressure and apply delegitimization. For all of these reasons, I believe the BDS is a problematic movement. Again, a footnote here. Among Palestinians in the West Bank, maybe Palestinians in Chicago are boycotting some Israeli products. Palestinians in the West Bank still buy Israeli. Why? Because they understand the reality. It's one thing, as a luxury to decide, I'm not going to buy an Israeli hummus, I'm going to buy, I don't know, a Palestinian hummus if you're living in Chicago or something, or New York. As a Palestinian, you understand that your fate and the Israelis' fate are linked, and therefore many of these issues just simply do not seep into the Palestinians who are living in the territories.
Thank you.
You mentioned the lack of leadership, strong parties to participate in a dialogue. Can you speak to the issue of Hamas and what the future might be and what role they might play in this process?
And I hope that no one's going to pick on that one. Look, Hamas, again, for those who don't know, Hamas is an Islamist movement, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, won an election in 2006, violently took over the Gaza Strip and has been governing the Gaza Strip. Now, with Hamas, it's very interesting. Hamas won the elections based on two platforms. They ran on a platform of two components. One component, and the most actually vocal component of Hamas, was anti-corruption. I mentioned how the corruption delegitimized and made it very difficult for leaders to emerge. Well, guess what? When Hamas started running Gaza, Hamas proved to be as corrupt, if not even more corrupt, if that's humanly possible, than the Palestinian Authority. To give you one anecdote, the son of the former Hamas Prime Minister, Ismail Haniyeh, his son went to Qatar for fertility treatment, came back with twins, with a set of twins, and a contract to build a soccer stadium. The exact same stuff that the PA was doing. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Hamas was no exception to that. Its legitimacy plummeted because of these practices. Also, Hamas was affected by what happened to Islamist movement in the Arab world. The beginning of the Arab Spring, if you remember, many people thinking the future is green, Islamists are going to rule everything. With the ouster of Morsi in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood really had its back broken in many ways. And Hamas one day found itself on the kind of leading the charge of what they thought history is going to bring. The next day found themselves on the defensive, part of a movement that is fundamentally weakened and broken in the Middle East. Right now, if you look at Palestinian opinion polls, 20% of Palestinians, if there's an election tomorrow, will vote for the PA, Palestinian Authority. 20% will vote for Hamas. The remaining 60% will vote for no one. And that is the lack of leadership. This is the vacuum that disturbs me most and maybe gives me hope, because when you have this vacuum, new voices can emerge.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Oliver.
Ghaith, how are you again? So from somewhere around 1924 till 1947, there was a geography called Palestine. And in that geography lived Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian. It was a land, okay? The most horrific crime that has ever been perpetrated, in my opinion, in this world, is that after the War of 48 And some Muslims, Arabs, they were not Palestinian, they could have been Egyptian, they were coming to work on kibbutzim and so on. When the Arab League voted that no country is to absorb them, that the Arab League said to however many Arab countries there were at the time, you will not absorb these people. We were going to keep them in these camps, and they've been in these camps now for 68 years, and they'll be taken care of by the UN, and it'll be a pressure point, for us to eventually push Israel into the sea. Tell me why, thank you. Tell me why doesn't the Arab League open up and change that resolution and allow these people to be absorbed? I know Palestinians in Egypt that, are still not citizens, but they're contributing engineers and things. You've got to get the Arab League to vindicate that particular thing, and these Arabs, these Muslims, who are not Palestinians before 1965 or 66, should be absorbed.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Martin. And actually, truly thank you for raising this, because this is something that is in many people's minds and many people just don't want to ask. So let me maybe rephrase your question. And, your question is there such a thing as a Palestinian people? That's at the bottom of it. I don't do this often, but I'm going to do it now. I'm going to quote Newt Gingrich. When he was running for president a few years ago, he was asked about the Palestinians, and he said, the Palestinians are an invented people. You know what? He was right, but incomplete. Every nation in that region right now, with a few exceptions, is an invented nation. Jordan, Syria, Iraq, not Egypt, not Iran, not Turkey, and not Israel as a state, but Jews as a nation and as a people. Every other nation actually is an invented nation. This was absolutely true back in 1917, 1920, whenever you want to draw the line. And indeed, in the early 20th century, there was a debate among Palestinians, like among every other Levantine country to become, between different identities: the local identity, Palestinian, Jordanian, etc., Pan-Arab identity, Levantine identity. With the creation of states, with the creation of the concept of nationhood, as we understand it from its European origins, this question has now become moot. In the sense that this might be true of the generation of 1915, 1920, 1925, today, everyone who defines themselves as Palestinians fully, deeply, completely believes that they are Palestinian. It is a collective identity. It's a national identity. I can come to someone of a different belief and different identity and try to convince them that what they believe is wrong, that their identity is wrong. This is one of the most futile things that we can do. Therefore, we have to accept as a reality that Palestinians now define themselves as a nation. They meet the necessary definition of a nation. Every time they were trying to be marginalized as a nation, like what Nasser did when he created the PLO in the 1960s, like what King Abdullah of Jordan, the grandfather, the founder, when he tried to annex the West Bank in 1949, all of these attempts were rejected by the Palestinians. It is interesting that the Palestinians rejected the Camp David Accords of 1979, rejected the 1987 Paris Accord between King Hussein and Shimon Peres, because these were seen as attempts to bypass them and speak for their names. We can have an historic argument about should the Palestinians have been a people, should they have not been a people. The reality today is that they are a people. And if we don't address the sense of nationality and the sense of nationhood and the political aspiration of these people, they will continue to seek this affirmation. And if they don't get it through peaceful means, this is how you create radicalization. We can't ignore it. It's a reality. I do believe that many of these complicated aspects of Arab-Palestinian history should be addressed by the Arabs. Some of the issues that actually the lady asked in the first question what some of the Arab countries do to Jews who are living in those Arab countries need to be addressed. These are domestic issues that these countries have to be addressed. But as a national, diplomatic, political issue, if you do not address the Palestinians' national aspirations, the Palestinians will continue seeking these aspirations. Many attempts to negate them have actually failed in the past.
Thanks very much, Raith. That's excellent. One, two. Okay, so we have three more people. We've got time to have all of you, but no more. No more joining the lines, so we'll deal with these three speakers here.
About 15, 16 years ago, I heard Dennis Ross speak, who was a negotiator to help. Maybe you know him very well.
Very, very well. Yes.
Okay. But one thing he said during the negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians was that Arafat walked away. Dennis Ross felt that that deal was 99% consummated, and at the last minute, Arafat, it was a two-state solution, Arafat walked away. So maybe you could give you were there probably, and maybe you could, okay. So I'd like to hear your opinion, and then what do you personally think about a two-state solution, and how would you put it together?
Okay. Well,
two very simple questions.
Well, we have to leave you something to do tomorrow, but please address the first one. This is very interesting. Sort of, was Arafat to blame? What happened?
First of all, I do know Dennis very well. Actually, Dennis and I were here 2 years ago at Chautauqua. That's how I got hooked on this place. Look. There are many stories about Camp David and many analyses about Camp David. I'm assuming Dennis was talking about Camp David.
What I'm talking about is what Dennis Ross actually said publicly.
Yeah. I mean, look, Camp David, you have a number of narratives. Dennis's narrative is Arafat walked away. What Rob Malley, who was the White House guy in Camp David, said, no, it was more complicated. My own view, and I was in Camp David, is the following. Camp David was not ripe for a deal. It was just not ripe. You have summits, here I'm going to go technical a little bit. You have summits in one of two cases. Either at the beginning of a negotiation to frame the issues for the negotiators, or at the end of a negotiation when you have 3, 4, 5 discrete, distinct decisions to be made by the leaders, you bring them to a summit. Camp David was neither. Camp David was a few months into the negotiations, and the issues were not ripe. Camp David, in many ways, was a tragedy, a comic tragedy in some ways. Sitting, and I remember this very well, with President Clinton in one of the cabins, poring over with Clinton, knowing the names of streets and alleyways in the old city of Jerusalem. Still working at this mid-level negotiation meant that we were not ready for that. Now, many mistakes were done. The Americans, on day 2, put forward a peace plan. Barak, the Israeli prime minister, threw a hissy fit and decided to leave. Arafat instructed us to pack our bags, and we did that. And then the Americans panicked and pulled that. Big mistake. Because it showed the Americans not to be particularly, they can be pushed around. Barak would give us drip kind of approach. Today he offers 60%. We say no, tomorrow it's 65%, the day after. So there wasn't kind of, it was almost a bazaar. From the Palestinian point of view, the biggest mistake we made, I believe, is the fact that we said no and we did not offer counter proposals. Not because we had no counter proposals. You know, I was brought to Camp David because I was the guy with the laptop with the counter proposals, with plan A, B, and C. Arafat, as a matter of negotiation tactics, decided not to do these, but to say no to everything, which created a sense with the Americans, with the Israelis, that Arafat was not interested. Now, we can go more and more and more about Camp David. I would just say one last point. A question that I don't know the answer to, and I've talked to people who've known Arafat way better than I have. I knew him tangentially. There are people I know who worked with him from the 50s. And I asked them this one question. Was Arafat ready for a peace deal? This is the one thing that no one can actually give you an answer to, because that's one thing that he truly never expressed to anyone. And I still, and many are still wondering about that. Camp David, though, had many mistakes. I think it's unfair to only blame one side for that failure.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I'm certain we will come back to some issues relating to this tomorrow. Now, last question on the left.
In 1948, There was a two-state solution suggested. The United Nations said we ought to partition this land and have two separate states. The Palestinians declined to do that. I always thought they declined to do it because they thought as soon as the British left, they would take everything and the Jews wouldn't get anything. What's your explanation for that?
You got it. True. No, I mean, it's not only, by the way, the Palestinians by themselves. This was a collective Arab decision. The Palestinians were part of it, but there was, this is truly both kind of a historic mistake and a historic tragedy. A mistake in the sense of gross miscalculation, but a tragedy because, look, I think, at the very core of this conflict, tomorrow we will talk about the politics of it, the diplomacy of it, and that means a lot, of course. At the very core of it is still, I think, two national movements that seek recognition. One thing that I found dealing with Israelis are very willing to be pragmatic, to give concessions, if you recognize a very basic Jewish connection to the land. Sadly, that generation of Arab leaders refused to recognize the very foundation of a Jewish connection to the land, the very legitimacy of Israel. This is, by the way, a legacy that we still live with until today. I think there is more recognition now, at least among the elites, but that was not only a mistake, that was a tragedy. And I believe until that is rectified, and of course on the other side, until the Israelis recognize that the Palestinians also have a legitimate connection to this land, a legitimate claim to this land, until we recognize this, and this becomes our operative premise, I fear that we are in for many, many failures. I do not know, and I can't tell you now, whether or not we have reached the tipping point where this has become common knowledge, but I can tell you that we are in a much better place in terms of public perception today than we were in 1947.
Yes, I understand that we're focusing on Israel and Palestine, but it seems to me as a somewhat casual observer that in fact the situation in the Middle East has gotten increasingly more complex. And I'm wondering if the complexity still swirls around Israel and Palestine, or if in fact the Arab-Israeli, many changes, it would appear to me, are affecting this too. So that, I guess, is if the answer is yes, there's more factors. Could you expand on that a bit?
And that's a question we had yesterday, and it's a very good one. So,
all right. The answer, I mean, it is complicated. The Arab Spring and all of the mess that we're seeing in the Arab and the post-Arab Spring certainly has very little, if anything, to do with the Palestinian-Israeli issue. From my own point of view, it is the failure of the social contract between many of these dictatorial Arab leaderships and their publics, the failure of the state to provide for the people, and this is what we see in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. There's a deep, deep structural problem that is specific to these countries. Now, some were very happy and very quick to, some in the Israeli right in particular, come and say, this means the Palestinian issue is irrelevant. The Arabs are busy with other things. Yes, Iran now is a bigger threat, etc., etc. And many actually deluded themselves with this. Yet what we saw actually just last month, with the sudden explosion on in Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the Har Habayit, whatever you want to call it, we saw that this issue remains very, very emotive, very capable of mobilizing, and very politically relevant. So I think everyone got a wake-up call. The Palestinians who believe that they are the center of the universe, some still do. The majority, though, understand that if they don't get on board the many changes, they will be left behind. Those on the Israeli side, and not all Israelis, not the majority of Israelis, but on the Israeli right, who believe that the Palestinian issue can simply be forgotten and swept under the table, have also gotten a rude awakening that this actually cannot happen. All I would say is, and I guess that's for tomorrow, for the US, for the parties, we should be able to both walk and chew gum at the same time. We should not have to choose that only this and only that. It's a complex situation. The more of the sources of this instability that we can address, the more that we can actually stabilize the overall situation.
Thank you so much.